Yeah, I've noticed if you don't start until exactly the time, it takes a couple minutes for people to trickle in, and I need those minutes. Let me tell you.
Yeah, especially when you have like a really engaging other conversation
Yeah.
happening. But there are people in here, so hello everyone.
Yes, absolutely. Hello.
Alrighty, it is 4. Let's get started to give you the most fun time. Alrighty, so hello everyone. My name is Roberto, and I will be helping with tech support and moderating the chat. This session is being recorded. I don't work for Zoom, but if you are having problems, mention it in the chat, and we will see if we can help. Also, when it comes to the Q&A, keep questions relatively family friendly, and also general rule: don't be a jerk. Um, and then we will, and today we have Wesley, who's going to be presenting about the interwar years and results-based analysis. And well, Wesley, take it off.
Okay, excellent. Thank you everybody for joining me here today. And so I'm going to give a presentation called The Correct Wrong Choice, Results-Based Analysis in the Interwar Years. Now, what are we going to talk about here today? So I'm going to discuss what I mean when I say results-based analysis, and then we're going to apply that to the Maginot Line, the much maligned series of fixed fortifications built by France during the interwar years. Then we will end the discussion with sort of how you can avoid falling into this trap when you are thinking about history yourself. So we got to start with the definition here. So when I say results-based analysis, what do I mean? At its most basic level, I simply mean judging a decision based on its results, which is something that seems really logical to do and is the easiest way to make an evaluation of a decision. However, there are some really big problems that it can cause because, quite simply, when people make decisions, they don't know the outcomes. They instead use a mixture of their knowledge of the past, information about the present, and their expectations of an unknown future. And this creates a situation in which a person can make a good decision based on all of the information that they have and still have that decision result in a negative outcome. And the inverse is also true. They can make a decision based on bad information and bad inferences about the results of that decision, and it can still have a positive income. I mean, good luck and bad luck. So how do we apply this to history? Using results-based analysis in history is very common. We discuss history from a point of retrospective omniscience. We often know far more information than those at the time. And more importantly, we know the results of the decisions that are being made. Many really concrete examples of applying this problem to history can come in the military history arena, where I'm kind of most comfortable. But also it's nice because a lot of times decisions and outcomes are relatively close together, kind of on the timeline. We might today know the exact troop positions and dispositions and plans, whereas those at the time, when they're planning a military operation, have to rely on sparse and often unreliable intelligence, which is based on sort of just what they have in front of them. We also know the outcome of the attacks that are planned. We know how effective that artillery bombardment would be, or whether or not half the enemy is combat ineffective with dysentery. And there are other times when we don't know as much information. As you go back in history, due to a lack of sources, you have less information. But in both cases, we can go through an exercise where we try to determine the information that was present at the time and the reasons that decisions were made. And then we can do sort of an analysis of those decisions, not just their outcomes. In this presentation, we will discuss the Maginot Line. So what was the Maginot Line? The Maginot Line would be a series of fortifications that would be built starting in 1928, with construction going in, various sort of spurts and starts until the start of the Second World War. Over that time, it would cost somewhere around 5 billion francs, which is not perfectly convertible, as no historical values are, but it certainly was a lot of money. This money built around 142 ouvrages, which you can think of as forts, hundreds of casemates and other smaller positions, and many other emplacements. The most complete and strongest area would be on the border between France and Germany. It was built first, and it was a series of fixed fortifications built with one goal in mind: protecting France from an attack by Germany. The line of fortifications would be extended to the north along the border between France and Belgium during the 1930s, but due both to lack of funding and the geological differences, these fortifications would not be nearly as strong or developed. I included some pictures of the Maginot Line because, this is a presentation and I can do those kinds of things, which is really freeing as a person who's only done a podcast where it's audio only. So some of these pictures, one of the things to note here is that this was not a fortification line in the style of the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall in the UK. And it was instead just a series of fixed fortifications that provided a rough line of resistance. And they were truly modern fortifications with retractable turrets and as much of the fortification as possible placed underground to protect it from artillery. On the left here, you can see the layout of an ouvrage with its defensive positions in the upper left, pointing towards where Germany would be coming from, and a long underground tunnel connecting those positions to the troop housings in the lower right. The ouvrage was the centerpiece of the line, and they were positioned strategically to provide the greatest benefit. Then in the middle picture here, you can see 3 turrets, with the one on the right having been restored, with all 3 of these armed with machine guns. I like this picture a lot because it shows the kind of positions that were provided to these turrets to kind of give them the greatest possible defensive abilities. This is France in the late 1920s planning for where it wants to fight the next war. And so it tried to use French geography to the greatest extent possible. But then something happened. On May 10th, 1940, the event that the Maginot Line had been built for would come to pass, and Germany would invade France. However, the attack would avoid the strongest pieces of the Maginot Line, and the Germans would famously drive through the Ardennes. This trapped most of the French and British armies in Belgium, where they had expected to meet the German attack head-on. After so many troops were cut off and would eventually either evacuate or be forced to surrender, the situation only got worse, and France would surrender 6 weeks later. Oddly enough, many of the areas of the Maginot Line were still under French army control when the fighting ended. And this has given the Maginot Line something of a reputation. Now, because of the absolute disaster that the German invasion of France was for France, with France capitulating so quickly and the French army being defeated so decisively, the Maginot Line was seen as something of a laughingstock, that it had failed in some way. So much effort and money had went into the Maginot Line, only for France to be so quickly defeated, that it must have failed in some way, or the very concept must have been compromised from the beginning. At the core of it, the Maginot Line did not prevent France's defeat. And honestly, it didn't even appear to really contribute to its defense. I love these 2 quotes that I've included above. The first quote using a metaphor for military incompetence, the second a monument to the folly of static defense. I think both of those are really good. I'll also point out, to defend the 2 authors, since I've just pulled very specific quotes from them, both of these authors really try and defend the Maginot Line in the same way that this presentation does. They try and look at it sort of, not just looking at its failure in 1940. So everything up to this point are about results, the things I started telling you not to look at simply when evaluating decisions. And so let's look at what led up to the Maginot Line. And to do that, we have to start during the First World War. France had suffered 1.3 million military deaths during the First World War, and total deaths for its entire population were 4.5%. What's even worse, even in victory, many of the challenges that France faced in 1914 and the years before were still in place. While the reparations are famous for how large they were, in the view of the French, many, pieces of the Treaty of Versailles were not harsh enough on Germany because it left the core of Germany intact. Many believed indeed that there would be another war with Germany in the near-term future, within their lifetimes. The geographical challenges of France also had not changed, with the most critical production and industrial areas of France being miles from the German border. They could be easily captured as they had been during the First World War. All of this forced France to consider how it would approach a future war, and it felt that it needed to do that early instead of waiting until a war started. So there were a lot of consequences of the First World War. Here we're going to talk a little bit about the demographic challenges. Before the First World War, France had been at a demographic disadvantage when compared with Germany. It had a smaller population, 41 million versus 68 million. It also had a lower birth rate, so there were more Germans than French being born at all times. This had already been considered a critical threat to French security, even before the casualties during the First World War were considered. And after the war, there was a catastrophe looming. Just as a side note, we often don't talk about things like this in the modern context around birth rates and populations, but this was a really big topic in, say, the first 50 years of the 20th century. Like, this was talked about at the political and military level all the time. So the top line number for France, 1.4 million casualties during the First World War, was bad. But it was coupled with the fact that birth rates during the war had been much lower. Millions of men had been at the front in the trenches in Champagne and Artois, and so they couldn't really make babies. This meant that the wartime cohorts of French children were massively smaller than in other years. I've included the population pyramid on this slide to kind of show when those numbers collapse, those are the wartime generations. French military planners could see this problem coming 18 years in advance. It's one of the advantages of this kind of problem. And it was known that the conscript classes of 1936 to 1938 would be much smaller than what had come before. And this was of great concern because, again, they thought there was going to be another war with Germany. Another major point of consideration was the type of war that the French thought they would be fighting in the future. In short, and this is a whole talk all on its own, for most of the 1920s and 30s, the French believed that a future war would look a lot like the war in 1918. Firepower would be key, defenses were critical, and it would be a positional struggle. There would be new technology, everybody recognized that, but they believed that it would serve to bolster the defense just as much as the offense. In a search for how to prepare for such a conflict, fixed defenses seemed to be the key. Throughout history, fixed defenses had been used to act as a force multiplier, allowing smaller forces to defend against larger attacking armies. While mounting this defense, they were often also safer and able to inflict more casualties on the attackers than they themselves suffered. They could also be prepared before the conflict even began, taking advantage of periods of economic strength if they presented themselves, like they would for France between 1929 and 1931. They also allowed the defender to pick which territory was to be defended and allowed for that defense to happen at a moment's notice. Finally, and critically, by the 20th century, it was well understood that no series of defenses were impregnable. Artillery was just too powerful. The First World War had proven that time and time again. But defenses could make it more challenging to move a certain direction, which could force the enemy to be channeled into a different direction. In the case of the Maginot Line, it would force the Germans to move through Belgium and the Low Countries, where the French could concentrate all of their available field forces. All of this, the idea of this large fixed defense piece of work was ideal for what the French needed. They knew that they would have a smaller army in a war with Germany. They knew that they had to defend those critical border regions where so much French industry sat just miles from the French border. And they believed that a war with Germany would happen soon and that they had to prepare. So just to recap, the Maginot Line was built because the French were applying the agreed upon principles of warfare to the problems they were facing after 1918, principles that all armies agreed with. The Germans invested massive amounts of money in the West Wall fortifications during the 1930s. In certain periods, it was their largest defense spending project. There was a cost for the French, though, because just the straight number of francs it took to build is one thing, but that money could have been spent on other things. Maybe the updating of French industry, which would have helped in the rearmament years of the late 1930s. But in the late 1920s, it was far less clear what changes could be made or what would have to be purchased or improved or altered to make the biggest change, a decade later. It was hard to tell, where to spend that money. The next question is, of course, did the Maginot Line succeed at all at what it was trying to do? And the answer to that is absolutely. When the Germans attacked, they had to try and find a way around the core Maginot Line fortifications. They never considered attacking it head on. They knew it would not go well. And experiences in Poland in 1939 would prove that the German army was not great at moving through fortifications, and the Poles were using nothing like what the Maginot Line had. But the problem is that the decisions that the Germans made were not what the French thought they would be making. The Maginot Line also allowed the French and British to focus most of their best troops and their best equipment on where they thought the Germans would go, in the north, in a race into Belgium, where they could theoretically meet a German attack head on before it even got to France. Now, I've been pretty defensive about the Maginot Line so far, but we do have to contend with the fact that France did suffer a catastrophic defeat in 1940, and we have to try and find some kind of reason for it. The long answer for why France was defeated, again, an entire different talk or a very long podcast episode. I'll get there eventually. But at the highest level, France simply did not understand what kind of war they would be called upon to fight. French leaders underestimated how the increase in mobility over the interwar years would affect how military operations were staged and executed. They misunderstood how the Germans would approach the problems they faced in attacking France. And they made just some real poor assumptions about how they should prepare and use the forces that the Maginot Line gave them the opportunity to use in a more proactive fashion. In general, the French just made a lot of really poor military choices that caused so many problems for them in 1940. The Maginot Line, maybe wasn't perfect, but at least it was able to achieve its objective, whereas most of the rest of the French military could not even come close to their sort of objectives or what France needed them to do. So how do we kind of try and avoid this trap? You're out there, you're reading or analyzing history, how does all of this apply to you? Well, I just like to advise people to think about how they evaluate decisions and whether or not you, as a person gifted with, again, retrospective omniscience, are fairly judging decisions based on the information that was used to make that decision. To be absolutely fair, this is way more difficult in some areas than others. Some areas of history, very spotty documentation. In my research, I'm dealing with the world wars. There are archives bursting with political and military documents explaining in sometimes too much detail on why certain decisions were made. Most other areas of history are very different, and that fine-grained information just isn't available as you move back in history. The firsthand sources become a lot more sparse. But that does not mean that the concept does not apply. I think a great mindset to approach some situations is to just try not to assume that actions with good outcomes were based on good decisions for good reasons, or that bad outcomes were caused by bad decisions. Our knowledge of events, another good example of this, and since he'll be doing a keynote here in a few hours, I've no problems, mentioning him, is Jamie Jeffers and his episodes on Hastings for the British History podcast and those leading up to Hastings. He does a really good job of sort of taking the information that we have available and re-examining it, and not taking kind of the default assumption that, well, the English lost, so they must have done something wrong, and the Normans won, so they must have been doing some good stuff. In general, if you approach analysis from the angle of this person or group succeeded, therefore they must be making smart choices, you can set yourself on the wrong course. It can cause you to incorrectly place blame when things go wrong, or to incorrectly give praise when things go right. So in closing, you can just follow the advice of Mr. Ted Lasso and be curious, not judgmental, which I think he tries to attribute to a quote that doesn't actually exist. So I'm just going to attribute it to him. And that went a little faster than I expected. I think I talked a little faster than I did in practice. So I think now sort of we are ready for questions if they exist. I believe you can get them in the Q&A or in the chat.
All righty. So the first question you have, David, is that David is curious about your thoughts on the role of contingency and success of the Maginot Line. Like, if French generals had made some better decisions in May of 1940, would the Maginot Line look like a much better idea, despite nothing about the Maginot Line being any different?
Absolutely. I think that sort of if the events of May 1940 play out a little differently, and let's say the Germans are stopped in their move through the Ardennes, or in any situation that you could come up with in which France defends itself quite well for even a reasonable amount of time, I think it would be sort of looked at quite differently. I think that if you look at the German experiences in Poland against fixed Polish fortifications, they do very poorly against fortifications that are much less than what we see in France. And so I think if the French do manage to create a war scenario that they are planning for, which is this positional struggle that doesn't end quickly, that doesn't play on this mobility quite as much, I think the Maginot Line would have really shown quite brightly in that regard, and probably would have been thought of higher than some of the older forts that were used in the First World War that kind of played the same role as the Maginot Line in some instances, like the situation around Verdun.
And then we
are muted. Okay, there you go.
There we go. Yeah, and then we have Christoph. So I'm guessing Christoph would like to ask a question locally. Let's go. You are allowed to talk.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question basically is, your analysis was that the French built the Maginot Line because they thought they needed to defend the direct border to Germany. And in that case, yes, they were successful because there weren't any breakthroughs along that line. And that enabled them to shift their forces northward because they were expecting an attack through Belgium. So why did the German forces succeed? Just because they didn't expect the attack to come through the Ardennes, or because the French leadership made bad choices when defending the northern border?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So a lot of French planning during the interwar years involves Belgium. And so the entire goal of the French is in the north to prevent the Germans from getting to France. They want to fight the war in Belgium. And so what happens when the war starts is the French and the British move their forces into Belgium. And this presents a problem when the Germans move through the Ardennes, because the French aren't planning for it, that section of the line is relatively weak, and the Germans do a good job in what they're trying to accomplish. And so this puts the French in a very rough position because their forces are simply overextended into Belgium and they get cut off. And so I think a lot of it comes down to there was some misunderstanding on the French side of how the Germans could attack them, but they just never wavered from the idea that the Germans are going to try essentially a Schlieffen Plan version 2 during the Second World War. And that's what they plan for. And they kind of get maybe a little bit of tunnel vision in that they start to believe that that's the only option for the Germans. And so they disregard some of the other avenues that they could approach from.
Okay, so in how far differed the approach taking the Second World War from the one taking the First World War? Was it just the avenue of attack, basically?
Essentially, yes. Yeah. So the avenue attack is different, but also it also ties back into something I think I mentioned earlier around the kind of misunderstanding of how mobility would play into a modern conflict. I think that the French were more confident in their ability to contain the German mobility and to slow advances to prevent the kind of breakout scenario you see in May 1940.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have a question from Sam Hume.
I'm gonna make myself bigger.
There we go. So Sam is asking, aside from the Maginot Line, what is another myth or misunderstanding that you hope to dispel during the podcast?
Oh man, there are so many. One of the ones I'm going to be talking about quite soon is kind of how the war in Poland played out. I think that Poland is often not given maybe as much credit as it could be for what happens in Poland. The German army has problems when it's attacking Poland, and also the Polish are forced into some really bad situations for political reasons, right? The Polish military and the Polish government are very concerned about getting Czechoslovakia essentially by the Western powers, and so instead of making the correct decisions around how to defend their country, they push their forces very close to the German border so that they're not stuck in a situation where the Germans sort of bite off a little bit of Poland and then say, okay, we're done. London, Paris, you want to talk about what's happening? And so it's not, the Polish military was probably better prepared than history gives them credit for. They were just put in an incredibly bad situation.
And then David asks another question. If I recall correctly, the Belgians and Dutch had some pretty significant modern defenses too, which fell a lot faster than people expected. Is that right? And does that say anything about how the Maginot Line would have helped up if the Germans hadn't focused on it?
Yeah, I think that if the Germans had focused all of their strength on the Maginot Line in an attempt to push through it, I think it probably would have not stopped them dead, right? It would not have been impervious to their attacks. I think it would have been very costly. And the difference between what would have happened in France and what happens in Belgium and the Dutch, who have defenses that are modern but are not on the scale of the line, is that they just had a lot more strength and resources backing up those defenses, right? So the French or the British or whoever was in that area of the front would have been able to push in more resources, where the Belgians and the Dutch were in many ways just overwhelmed at a point with the German attacks.
I actually have a question for you. So how exactly is it that you go around picking the music for your podcast?
So the music for my podcast is in 2014, I was like, hey, I need a song to put on the beginning of my podcast. What can I find that's rights free? And recently I had watched the movie Das Boot, which quite prominently features the Long Way to Tipperary song. And so that's just what I went with. I thought it sounded good. I've tried a couple things over the years. I tried a series specific music at times, national anthems and things like that, but that never quite felt right. So I just keep coming back to Long Way to Tipperary.
And for Second World War?
It's kind of the same. It's just a smaller piece. I think I didn't want to make people sit through 20 seconds again. A lot of people were hitting that skip button. So I just cut it down. So it's just a smaller piece of the same song.
All right, perfect. And then Elizabeth asks, did the Hail Mary pass of getting through the Ardennes contribute to the overconfidence of the German war machine?
Absolutely. I think basically all of the early war campaigns made the Germans very confident in their abilities. And you can knock them, but they did achieve their objectives very quickly. And it did give them, they came into France with a lot of experience that other armies simply did not have. But so the really fast move through France. So what the Germans don't gain in those opening campaigns, you're looking at places, Poland and Norway and the Low Countries and France. What they don't gain is experience fighting a long, drawn-out conflict. The kind of stuff that they would be facing in Russia quite prominently, but also, in Africa and in Western Europe later on. And so the German kind of military was very good at these short campaigns where they didn't have to have a lot of logistics. They didn't have to have a lot of material or spare parts or replacements or anything like that, because they were just running over people so quickly. And so all of that fed into this overconfidence that when they get to Russia, what happens is they have those opening successes and it works incredibly well. It works better than it ever had before, but it doesn't result in the enemy capitulating, in a couple of weeks, which is what had always happened before. And so then they start running into these problems that they really don't have a lot of experience dealing with around, attrition and replacements and equipment and maintenance and things like that, where previously they had been done with their campaigns before that had become a problem.
And another question from David. The French lost in 1940 due in part to structural and strategic reasons, but loss of national morale and will to fight was a big part of it. Did the Maginot Line play any significant role in shaping how French national morale played out? For example, perhaps by fostering overconfidence?
Yeah, French psychology in the years leading up to the Second World War is difficult. I think that you're absolutely correct in that while the French military made some sort of bad choices in a lot of ways, and while they put themselves in a bad situation, it was not as bad as what it became because of morale problems, because of the sort of military quitting is a strong word, but maybe not putting up the resistance that they hoped. And there are some really good articles out there that talk about and I don't know if there's books out there, but there's definitely PhD theses and things like that talk about sort of French psychology after the First World War and how their experiences of the war impacted things going forward. One of the authors I really like, I wish I could remember the name, talks about how Verdun and kind of this mythic defense of a fixed fortification position was really impactful for multiple generations of French military leaders. They saw Verdun as a victory where sort of French morale won out in this fixed position over the German attacks. And that influences, the creation of the Maginot Line and French preparation for the Second World War, but also has influences all the way up to their experiences in Vietnam, with the siege of Dien Bien Phu and those experiences there, where there was just this belief among French military leaders that somehow the French would persevere in these kind of defensive struggles without necessarily a lot of reason to assume that they would. They just kind of thought it would work out because it had at Verdun.
Any other questions? I'd like to mute myself too much for some reason. I don't see any hands up.
So Roberto, question for you.
Oh, okay.
When's your new podcast coming out?
Where's the schedule? It is a new podcast is coming out on July 16th.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's gonna be fun. Yeah, we got a question from Zoe. I hope I said that right. How much of a role do you feel that the brutal experience of World War I for the French and the sheer loss of life they experienced as a result contributed to the poor decisions they made and the speed of their surrender?
It definitely contributed. You can't, as a nation, you can't have that experience and not be affected. I think that a lot of other nations suffered just as much. Like if you look at Germany or Russia or Austro-Hungarian Empire, like they all suffered a lot during the First World War, but they all had breaks. They had situations that drastically changed the nation that they were, whereas France was the same nation. It's the same line of government after 1918, which a lot of other nations sort of did not experience. And so I think that the legacy of the First World War and the fact that, when you get to the Second World War, many of the French leaders had been so closely involved with what had happened during the First World War, certainly affects their decision-making when it continue this war on such a bad footing, which is the sort of the decision that is forced upon them in June 1940.
Then we have a question from David. Favorite Sabaton song about the World Wars?
100% Stormtrooper. It's the first song on one of their albums, but that one is the best one. Bit of a tangent here. I like metal, but I like metal that I can understand the lyrics on. I'm not much of a growly metal sort of person. And so a lot of Sabaton songs really go for the like growly, yelly sort of stuff. That's not really my jam, but I think Stormtrooper's good.
Mine's Panzerkampf. So from Sam, when will you finish the history of the Second World War?
A long time from now. For those who don't know, who don't listen, maybe there's people in the chat that don't listen. I haven't got to the war yet. We're episode 100 next week or 101 next week. I'm getting there. I kind of view it as at least a 10 to 12 year endeavor. Is kind of my very loose planning at this point. But also, I haven't gotten into the war years, so I don't know what my I will call it speed of advance through the war years will look like yet, because I haven't gotten there. It's going to take a long time to get through some of those, middle war years where there's 4 different fronts happening to discuss.
Okay, so you'll probably get there by the time you get to Tipperary.
Yeah.
So we have a few more questions. And we have 5 minutes, so we're going to get these 2 last ones. So from Royfield Brown, how do you feel about Bulgaria and Hungary's participation in the war as they were forced by Germany into World War II?
Yeah, so I feel ill-equipped to discuss Bulgaria's participation, but Hungary, I recently did some episodes on Hungary, and I think that Hungary's in this position after the First World War where it is surrounded by people who really hate Hungary. And so, the little entente is surrounding Hungary. And so it is forced into a position of kind of being an outcast. It was seen as, being with the Austrians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all that. And so they are put in a position where they don't have a lot of friends around them, but then they make some decisions that bring them really close in with Germany. They see Germany as a way to improve their economic situation. They work out economic deals with Germany that sort of tie it really closely to the German economy in a lot of ways. And, they also have a government that has sort of irredentism built into its DNA, where trying to recapture territory that had been taken by other nations that the Hungarian government felt was Hungarian was a big part of what they were hoping to achieve in a future conflict. And so while yes, eventually they were kind of pulled into a war with Germany, they made a lot of decisions that put them in a position where Germany could do that.
Okay, and this one's from Cecil. A big question. To what extent did the anti-communist rhetoric of the Nazis help to undermine Franco-British will to fight them in the West?
I don't think that necessarily played a large role. I think that by the time they end up invading France, because they've made the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, and it seems that they've kind of united in some way, or at least aren't going to fight each other, which is what the British and French were hoping for. I think that if anything, it certainly stacked the deck more against the Franco-British coalition or alliance. But I don't think it necessarily probably had a huge impact at a lower level, like a person-to-person level. It was more of a governmental, boy, the chips are even more stacked against us now.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question. This is one from Robert. How much did the idea that France had won World War I and Germany losing affect their relative philosophies of waging war before World War II?
Yeah, so this is huge. So this is one of my favorite topics. Oh boy, I've only got a couple minutes. So one of the really interesting things that happens between France and Germany, we'll just use those as an example, although this could be applied to other nations, is because of the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, essentially the German army is dismantled entirely. It's allowed a small peacekeeper force, and it does things like make agreements with the Russians so it can test out tanks and stuff. But for all intents and purposes, the German army that existed in 1918 does not exist in 1921. And so this creates a really interesting situation in which a lot of the ties to the previous sort of German military are broken. And the new German military, the Reichswehr, is forced to plan for a war with an entirely new set of constraints upon it. And it forces the Germans to kind of rethink how they think about warfare. And they do that for over 10 years, where they're like, okay, we've only got this to work with. How are we going to approach a war if somebody attacks us? And then also they can think about, how are we going to expand in the future? And it sort of frees them from the problems of the French, where the French won. So they still have the same military. They largely keep the same military leaders, although a lot of them, of course, retire. But they also keep the same military traditions, and they don't feel like they have to reevaluate their military theory at a core level, because in the end they were victorious. They won. So even if it wasn't optimal, they still won. So you don't get that really core reevaluation of how to approach war that you see in places like Germany, and that you also see in places like Russia or other nations.
And that is all the time we have for today. So Wesley, thank you so much for answering all these amazing questions and for this fantastic and interesting presentation. You can also, there's a chat, you can find Wesley on a bit afterwards, so if you want to stay around and chat for a bit. But I hope you guys have been having fun with Intelligence Speech. So thank you so much, Wesley.
Yeah, thank you everybody who showed up, and thank you, Roberto, for being my admin for this.
Of course, anytime.